Life has a funny way of testing us when we're already at our lowest. But sometimes those tests are actually doors to something bigger than we could ever imagine. This is Sarah's story. A story that reminds us how a simple act of kindness can change not just one life, but create ripples that touch countless others. The fluorescent lights of Joe's diner cast a soft glow through the rain-streaked windows, painting shadows that danced across the worn linoleum floor. It was another quiet evening in downtown Memphis, the kind where time seemed to slow down and minutes stretched like hours. Sarah Williams stood behind the counter, her reflection barely visible in the well-polished surface she'd been wiping down for what felt like the 100th time that evening. "Just 2 more hours," she whispered to herself, forcing a smile as she glanced at the clock reading 8:15 p.m. The rain had scared away most customers, leaving only the occasional trucker seeking refuge from the storm. The kind of night where tips would be scarce, tips she desperately needed. Her feet ached in her worn-out sneakers, the same pair she'd been meaning to replace for months. But somehow there was always a more urgent bill to pay. Her mother's medication. The overdue electric bill. The rent that kept creeping up every year. In Sarah's world, new shoes were a luxury she couldn't afford to dream about. The soft chime of the bell above the door pulled Sarah from her thoughts. An elderly man shuffled in, his gray coat dripping onto the recently mopped floor. But Sarah didn't mind, not tonight. There was something about his eyes, tired but kind, that reminded her of her late grandfather. The same gentle dignity, the same quiet strength. "Welcome to Joe's," Sarah called out, already reaching for a menu and fresh coffee pot. Her voice carried the warmth she'd learned to maintain even on her toughest days. "Sit anywhere you'd like, sir. It's not exactly crowded tonight." The small attempt at humor earned her a warm smile from the man as he settled into booth 7, the one with the best view of the rain-swept street. "Thank you, young lady," he said, his voice gentle but slightly shaky. "And please call me James." Steam rose from the coffee cup as Sarah filled it, the rich aroma momentarily masking the typical diner smells of grease and cleaning solution. She noticed his hands trembling slightly as he held the menu. His clothes were neat but worn, and there was a certain weightiness in his shoulders that spoke of burdens too heavy to share. "Our meatloaf is pretty good tonight," Sarah offered, remembering how her mother always said food could comfort a troubled soul. "Made fresh this morning. Miss Betty, our cook, she's been making it the same way for 20 years. Says it's her grandmother's recipe." James looked up, relief washing over his face. "That sounds perfect. With mashed potatoes, if you have them? Coming right up. Would you like some green beans with that? They're fresh, not from a can." Sarah added the last part with a conspiratorial wink, bringing another smile to James's tired face. Over the next 40 minutes, Sarah watched discreetly as James savored every bite of his meal, eating with the deliberate pace of someone making food last. She'd seen that look before, in her own mirror on days when paychecks were still too far away. Between refilling his coffee and checking on her other tables, she noticed him pulling out a small notebook, making careful calculations in the margins. The rain continued its steady drumming against the windows, creating a melancholic symphony with the quiet clinking of cutlery and the distant sounds of the kitchen. Sarah found herself making extra trips to his table, drawn by a nagging feeling that this man needed more than just a hot meal. When she brought his check, $14.32, James reached for his wallet, and that's when everything changed. His face fell as he patted his pockets, once, twice, 3 times. The color drained from his face, replaced by a look of shame that made Sarah's heart ache. I seem to have..." His voice cracked slightly, hands shaking more now. "My wallet. I must have left it." The shame in his eyes made Sarah think of her own father, years ago, when he'd lost his job and couldn't buy her the birthday cake he'd promised. Without hesitation, Sarah picked up the check. "Don't worry about it, James. It happens to everyone." She pulled out her tip money, the money she'd been saving for her mother's prescription refill. But somehow this felt right. Something in her gut told her this was more than just a forgotten wallet. No, I couldn't possibly." James started to protest, his voice thick with emotion. "Consider it my good deed for the day," she said firmly, though kindly. "Besides, My grandfather always said what goes around comes around. He taught me that kindness isn't about what we can afford, it's about what we can't afford not to give. Just, maybe come back and visit us again sometime? James stood slowly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Young lady, thank you. You have no idea what this means. He reached out and squeezed her hand gently. Your grandfather was a wise man. As James walked toward the door, Sarah noticed he stood a little straighter, his shoulders no longer quite so burdened. He turned back one last time. What's your name? Sarah. Sarah Williams. Sarah Williams, he repeated as if committing it to memory. You've given me more than just a meal tonight. You've given me faith. Faith in humanity, faith in kindness, faith in the goodness that still exists in this world. With those words, he disappeared into the rain, leaving Sarah standing there, holding her remaining tips, now $14.32 lighter. Her mother's prescription would have to wait another day. But somehow, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Sarah didn't know it then, but that $14.32 would turn out to be the best investment of her life. But before that miracle could unfold, she'd have to face 2 weeks that would test every ounce of her strength. 2 weeks that would push her to the very edge of her faith in those same values her grandfather had taught her. Because sometimes, before our biggest blessings, life has a way of making us prove just how much we believe in the power of kindness. They say the darkest hour is just before dawn. For Sarah Williams, the next 2 weeks would test that saying in ways she never imagined. The morning after her encounter with James, Sarah's reality came crashing back with the harsh buzz of her 5 a.m. alarm. Her small apartment, barely big enough for two, was already filled with the sound of her mother's labored breathing. The machine helping her breathe hummed steadily, a constant reminder of the bills that kept piling up. "Morning, Mama," Sarah whispered, checking the oxygen levels before starting her daily routine. Her mother's condition had worsened over the past month, and the prescription refills were becoming more frequent. More expensive. "Baby girl," her mother's voice was weak but warm. "You worked late again, didn't you?" Sarah forced a smile, the same one she'd perfected over years of hiding her worries. "Just the usual shift, Mama. Besides, Joe's giving me extra hours next week." She didn't mention that those extra hours would barely cover last month's electric bill. The days began to blur together. Wake up at 5 a.m. Check on Mama. Morning shift at the local coffee shop from 6 to 2. Quick change of clothes in the bathroom. Evening shift at Joe's until closing. Home by midnight. Repeat. Each day brought new challenges. The coffee shop cut everyone's hours. Business was slow. Her car started making that noise again, the one the mechanic said would cost $800 to fix. The pharmacy called. Her mother's insurance was questioning the frequency of her prescription refills. "Just hold on," Sarah would whisper to herself during brief breaks, counting tips that never seemed to add up to enough. Something has to change. 1 week after James's visit, Sarah sat at her tiny kitchen table, bills spread out before her like a losing hand of cards. Electric bill, $142 overdue. Rent, due in a week. Mother's new prescription, $235. Car repair, impossible. The $14.32 she'd spent on James's meal now seemed to mock her from the margin of her budget notebook. "Sarah?" Her mother called from the other room. "Are you eating dinner, baby?" "Yes, Mama," she lied, pushing aside the bills and instant ramen she couldn't bring herself to cook. "Just finishing up." The second week brought more storms, both literal and figurative. The coffee shop closed for 2 days due to flooding. No work meant no tips. No tips meant choosing between gas for her car and her mother's medicine. "I'm sorry, Miss Williams," the pharmacist said, sliding the prescription back across the counter. "Without the full payment, I can't." Sarah felt her world spinning. "Please, can I pay half now and half next week? She needs this." "She can't." But rules were rules. Sarah drove home in silence, her gas gauge flirting with empty, just like her hope. That night at Joe's, every customer seemed to blur together. Every coffee refill, every forced smile, every "how's everything tasting?" felt mechanical. She kept glancing at booth 7, half expecting to see James there again. But he never came. "You okay, sugar?" Miss Betty, the cook, asked during a slow moment. "You're looking awful tired." Sarah just nodded, not trusting her voice. How could she explain that she was more than tired? That she was scared? That every time her mother coughed, her heart stopped a little? The breaking point came exactly 13 days after James's visit. Sarah's car finally gave out, right in the middle of her morning commute. The repair bill might as well have been $1 million. She sat there, hazard lights blinking weakly, and for the first time in years, she let herself cry. "I'm sorry, Grandpa," she whispered to the empty car. "I tried to believe in kindness. I tried to stay strong. But I don't know how much longer I can." Her phone buzzed, a text from her mother, feeling worse. "Don't worry, baby girl. God provides." Sarah looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror, tears streaming down her face. In less than 12 hours, she'd need to choose between her mother's medicine and keeping their lights on. The kind act she'd shown James now felt like a luxury she couldn't have afforded. Sometimes, she could hear her grandfather's voice in her head, "God tests our faith by making us wait for the miracle." She didn't know then that the miracle was less than 24 hours away. That tomorrow, a black SUV would pull up to Joe's diner. That her life was about to change in ways she couldn't imagine. But that's tomorrow's story. Tonight, Sarah Williams went home to her sick mother, made her tea she couldn't afford, and chose to believe for one more day. Because sometimes that's all we can do, believe for just one more day. Life's biggest moments often arrive disguised as ordinary days. For Sarah Williams, that moment came on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 2 weeks after a simple act of kindness changed everything. The lunch rush at Joe's diner had just ended when 3 black SUVs pulled into the parking lot. Sarah, exhausted from another sleepless night worrying about bills, barely noticed them through the window she was cleaning. Her mind was elsewhere, on her mother's worsening condition, on the final warning from the electric company, on the broken-down car she couldn't afford to fix. The diner's bell chimed, and Sarah turned, ready to recite her usual greeting. The words died in her throat. There stood James, but not the James she remembered. Gone was the shabby coat and worried expression. Instead, he wore an impeccable suit, his posture straight and confident. Behind him stood 2 men in equally expensive suits, carrying briefcases. "Hello, Sarah Williams," James said warmly, his eyes twinkling with the same kindness she remembered. "I believe I owe you $14.32. Sarah's cleaning rag dropped to the floor. "James? I don't understand. May we sit? Booth 7, if it's available." I've grown rather fond of that spot. Still stunned, Sarah led them to the booth where their story had begun 2 weeks ago. The diner had fallen silent, other customers watching with undisguised curiosity. "First," James began, pulling out an envelope, "let me properly repay my debt." He placed $14.32 on the table. "But that's not why I'm here. Sarah, do you know who I am?" She shook her head, trying to make sense of this surreal moment. "My name is James Harrison. Until last month, I was the CEO of Memphis General Hospital. That night, 2 weeks ago, I was conducting a personal experiment. You see, I'm retiring after 40 years in healthcare, and I needed to make a decision about my legacy." One of the men in suits opened his briefcase, pulling out documents. "I spent that evening visiting different establishments, pretending to have forgotten my wallet. I wanted to see how people would react. Would they show kindness to a seemingly confused old man? Would they be patient? Understanding?" Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. 6 different places, Sarah. 6 different opportunities for someone to show simple human kindness. Do you know what happened at the first 5 places? She shook her head again. I was treated with suspicion, disdain. At one place, they threatened to call the police. But then I came here. And you... His voice softened. You didn't hesitate. You paid for my meal with your own tip money, money I later learned was meant for your mother's medication. Tears began forming in Sarah's eyes. How did you? I've spent the last 2 weeks learning everything I could about you, Sarah Williams. Your morning shifts at the coffee shop. Your dedicated care for your mother. Your dream of becoming a doctor. A dream you put aside to care for her. I spoke with your employers, your neighbors, even your mother's doctors. The second lawyer opened his briefcase, revealing more papers. Sarah, I'm here today because I've made my decision about my legacy. I've decided to establish the Harrison Foundation for Medical Education, and I want you to be its first recipient. He slid a document across the table. Sarah's vision blurred as she tried to read through her tears. Full scholarship to medical school. All expenses paid. Plus a monthly stipend to cover living expenses for both you and your mother. He smiled. Immediate medical care for your mother at Memphis General's best facility, under our top specialists. All expenses covered. Sarah's legs gave out, and she sank into the booth. Miss Betty appeared from the kitchen, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. But wait. Sarah managed to whisper. Because kindness matters, Sarah. Because in a world that's growing colder and more cynical by the day, you chose to help a stranger without expecting anything in return. You showed me that compassion isn't dead, that the values I've tried to instill in my hospital staff for 40 years still exist in the wild. James reached across the table, taking her trembling hands in his. Your grandfather was right about kindness coming back around. Sometimes it just takes 2 weeks and 3 black SUVs. The lawyer spent the next hour explaining the details, the scholarship terms, the medical care arrangements, even a signing bonus to fix her car. Through it all, Sarah sat in a daze, tears flowing freely. There's one condition, James said finally, his eyes serious. When you become a doctor, and you will become a doctor, Sarah Williams, I want you to remember this moment. Remember how it feels when kindness comes full circle. And then, pass it on. By the time they left, the entire diner was in tears. Miss Betty was hugging everyone in sight. Joe himself had emerged from his office, beaming with pride. And Sarah? Sarah stood by booth 7, holding the papers that would change her life forever. That evening, as she sat by her mother's hospital bed, watching her breathe easily for the first time in months, Sarah remembered the moment 2 weeks ago when she'd chosen kindness over practicality. You see, sometimes miracles don't look like we expect. Sometimes they look like an elderly man forgetting his wallet. Sometimes they look like a waitress choosing kindness over caution. And sometimes they look like 3 black SUVs in a diner parking lot. But the real miracle? That's happening right now, in hospitals and clinics across Memphis, where Dr. Sarah Williams treats every patient with the same kindness she once showed a stranger on a rainy night. Because that's how kindness works, it multiplies. It grows. And sometimes, it comes back around in ways we never could have imagined.